Welcome to Fast Effect Double Speed Magic the Gathering from ELD's Time Vault Games. Here we have Matt on Blue Red Delver versus Rob on a 4-color Uro pile. Definitely control decks are built to stop the perceived threats in the meta. Blue Red Delver, perhaps the biggest threat that there is right now, making up a substantial portion of the metagame. It has cooled off a little, but it is certainly still a deck you have to be prepared for. Uro naturally lines up quite well there, having the incidental life gain, offsetting cards like Dragon Rage Channeler and Delver of Secrets. Cumulative effect. Prismatic Ending taking out one of these 1-drops, however, immediately replaced by Delver of Secrets. Prismatic Ending and Swords to Plowshares allow for a ton of counterplay with these inexpensive creatures. Now, Life from Loam actually picking up lands from the graveyard. That's another way to attack Delver. They use Wasteland to try and restrict your amount of resources, and Life from Loam can completely Uno reverse card that. They've put a land into the graveyard. You're getting yours back along with some previous fetch lands. And I mean, it's practically an ancestral recall in that context, potentially returning 3 lands to your hand and being able to come back later on, sort of, ready to draw some more lands. Expect this 4-color pile to just make a land drop each turn, get farther and farther ahead, as long as that's allowed to continue. Narset, and no ticking here. So Narset doesn't dig. Pyroblast takes her out, so that's rough. A no-value Narset. Now, if that Delver had flipped, would have been able to clear the Narset on its own after a single activation. It didn't flip. Ends up trading card for card with Pyroblast. Goes main deck largely for the mirror, taking out Murktide. You're not able to handle that card consistently with Unholy Heat. That was kind of the first card that people were going with, but it's not uncommon for Murktide to be outside of Unholy Heat range. That is when you need your removal most. So Pyroblast gets the job done there, and of course is excellent at fighting on the stack. Going very wide, actually prompting a Force of Will on a threat here. Forcing Delver, just Rob refusing to fall too far behind. Expressive Iteration. This probably needs to be a pretty good iteration. See an Uro being exiled. That is not a bad look at all. So Uro gaining 3 life, offsetting this onslaught of tiny human wizards right now. Just 1/1s. I suppose it's a shaman. I think it's a shaman. Let me know. They're humans for sure. But here's a Murktide, and that is going to make the 3 life gain from Uro much less impressive if this huge threat isn't handled. Expressive Iteration found the Uro. We need to find a towards the Plowshares off this Brainstorm. Maybe looking to cast this during Matt's turn. I believe we saw a Force of Negation at some point. Not casting it during the upkeep, just going to main phase that. So many duels. Here comes Uro. You really do need a lot of dual lands to make Uro work. Just heavy, heavy colored requirements. Well, I suppose, obviously in a 4-color shell you need a ton. There may be ways of doing blue-green build. Chain Lightning and Lightning Bolt. Trying to take out Uro. Is that what's happening here? And just come back. Potentially. Ooh. Force a negation. Daze trying to counter it. What a firefight here. Force a negation and force of will. Wow, Uros remains on board. And what a follow-up with expressive iteration. That is pretty much the best thing he could hope for there. Generate some card advantage. Uro's going to send. Gain 3 life. Draw a card. Now Ponder's going to dig further. So much library manipulation. Rob getting greatly affect the quality of cards that he has. That's what control decks are looking to do. Those answers have to line up with your opponent's threats. Be any use at all in there. Digging to find swords to plowshares. Gets it out of the way. Flusterstorm counters a Hellbent Brainstorm. Just Uro versus Delver of Secrets at this point. That is absolutely a losing race. Looks like Mystic Sanctuary put Prismatic Ending on top of the library. Again, it's a great answer to all of these inexpensive creatures. Terrible versus Murktide, but absolutely sufficient when you're dealing with Delver of Secrets or Dragon Rage Channeler. And Uro grinds that one out despite a heavy amount of threats for Delver. Delver doesn't even usually want that volume of threats, but versus this 4-color pile, gonna have to get past Swords to Plowshares, Prismatic Ending. Now, whatever he's bringing in out of the sideboard, certainly going to be prepared for Blue-Red Delver. That is one thing that you need to know when you're playing the deck is games 2 and 3, your opponent is certainly going to have some choices made far in advance of the tournament, specifically to ruin your day. Possible that they'll have some main deck hate for you, but let there be no doubt post-board. People will be ready. Pyroblast, allowing Delver to flip. And that is kind of what you're looking for here. Delver into another Delver. Swords to Plowshares takes out one of them. Matt not going to fight. Fine with a single threat. Uro makes it pretty difficult to stabilize. The fact that he creates value when you're casting him that first time. If they counter him, well, they're guy's still in the graveyard. It's not really like losing a card. Of course, casting him out of the graveyard. And favorably, either you're going to resolve it, draw a card on your way towards victory, or your opponent counters it and they're down a card. Or 2 in the case of Force of Will. Surgical Extraction. Going to clear out all the Swords to Plowshares, showing still a dangerous hand. We've got Uro and Endurance along with a Pyroblast. Rob plays this. Potentially take care of this Delver of Secrets right away. Pyroblast, he can play an Endurance. Act as a blocker against it. He's got options. Could literally play any of those cards in hand justifiably. Hang on, if he draws a land or not, I think it's a question whether to jam Uro. And also whether or not you think Surgical Extraction being played there indicates not having another copy of it in hand. Want to use a Surgical kind of carelessly. Oh, and he's got the Prismatic Ending. So Swords to Plowshares gets taken care of. Prismatic Ending still shows up. And Maddening Hex. Wow. So Maddening Hex is exactly the type of card that you'd want Prismatic Ending for. First, that can win the game on its own. A commander card. Really didn't take into account kind of tournament play. Maddening Hex being passed around the table of 4 commander players, that's a very different thing than your opponent getting the Maddening Hex and it never leaving them. Seen some pretty comical eye rolls where people have taken 16 plus damage from playing 3 spells to lose the game. Aggressive iteration for Matt, that surgical extraction earlier, taking out swords to plowshares, but prismatic endings still in the deck. Good answer to the Maddening Hex. Down to just 12, which could be 2 spells. I mean, Maddening Hex is pretty random. It's, 3.5 damage per spell on average. Endurance looking to hold down the fort. Resolves, it'll get rid of Murktide, or delay Murktide for a few turns. Wow, and actually putting surgical extraction on top of the library with Mystic Sanctuary. Fetching up Mystic Sanctuary, really valuing the surgical. Now a Pyroblast. Gonna stop this Uro. Seem surgical's gonna look to sure there's no more Uros left. Storm takes 3 damage and gets Pyroblasted anyways. In life. Probably 2 to 3 spells can be played here underneath this Maddening Hex. This compares kind of like cards like Eidolon of the Great Revel and Sulfuric, Pyrostatic Pillar, not Vortex. So that is in the same family. Pesky enchantments. Yeah, the next spell Rob plays, depending on the roll of the die, could just have us headed to game 3. I feel like anything shy of Prismatic Ending isn't going to be good enough. And getting another Endurance. Ponder. Non-creature spells. Thing that Rob can really be doing with this Maddening Hex out. Anything else is going to result 6 worth of damage. Endurance is pretty tough to get past. These smaller creatures, one of them turning sideways. Wasteland. Back on resources. Aggressive iteration. And it's good enough for the Dragon Rage Channeler. That Surveil from Dragon Rage really needs to be used aggressively. Find what you're looking for. Filling the graveyard is actually a resource Playing with Murktide. And the deck is redundant enough that putting a card that you're pretty okay with into the graveyard is totally fine. You want the quality cards coming off the top are actually going to help in your situation. Two Dragon Rage Channeler is just going to make all of the cantrips that much better. Ponder reveals one card. Next one's a keeper. Has to attack, so one of these Dragon Rage goes away, and then Matt's got the Lightning Bolt to finish it off. So we are headed to game number 3, what is turning out to be a pretty epic match here. Game 3, Rob leads out with Flooded Strand, as does Matt, so no early drop. Blue-Red Delver, obviously the more aggressive of the two decks, but can play a control role as well. I mean, Pyroblast, bunch of other counters. Doesn't have to just walk right into removal. Dragon Rage Channeler. One land open, so Brainstorm and Fetch. Not have a reply, get a little bit of value out of this. Surveil trigger. Fetching. Yep. All right, so just fetch, no Brainstorm, end of turn. Steam Vents entering tapped. When you can kind of expect it to be a slog when you're a Blue-Red Delver player. Opponent is playing Steam Vents tapped on turn 3. They are looking for a long game. Endurance versus Dragon Rage. Dragon Rage is going to stay small for a bit as Endurance mops up that graveyard. And 4-color Uro is the beatdown now. Could just be 6 more turns. Bolt, Scry, putting a bauble in the bin. Hydroblast. Take out the Dragon Rage. Matt trying to give up a 2-for-1 to get rid of this Endurance, but Rob would rather trade all of that for the 1-mana Hydroblast instead, and it looks like he's going to get his way. No, wow, 2 bolts though. So Hydroblast saving Endurance temporarily. A double bolt gets the 3-4 off the board. That is not how you draw it up. In Surgical Extraction, actually going further. The Life from Alone, Boseiju, in a Red Elemental Blast left in hand. Surgical pushes more towards card disadvantage. So losing the 2-for-1 battle over Endurance, or winning, I guess, paying that price, and then surgicaling it to make sure there's no more Endurances. This Dragon Rage is pretty well lined up versus those remaining cards, though. Expressive Iteration is not what you want to see there. Pyroblast trigger. Maddening Hex again. Matt putting himself in good shape. Be happier once this Dragon Rage Channeler flips. Right now, Well, I say that. He's probably not very happy that it flips due to the enchantment. Boseiju clears the Maddening Hex with no drawback. Actually, he already knew that was there. Not a whole lot that can be done about it. Mystic Sanctuary goes up, looking to put something on top of the library, and another Surgical Extraction, this time hitting Expressive Iteration. Boy, if you hit Uro with a Surgical, I'm not sure what this 4-color pile is going to do. And they can certainly drag the game out. Not really clear how they're going to win, losing Endurance and Uro. There's any Planeswalkers in there that can win the game. Under. Surgical Extracting win conditions. Part of a long game. Not something that I've ever been a fan of. It's interesting to see it here. You know what you think about that in the comments. I'm very pro-surgical, of course, versus the graveyard decks. I think it's a fine card. Fairy Macabre may be better currently, but due to its uncounterability and being a creature spell, a lot of interactions that make that preferable. So Murktide showing up. Obviously, Surgical is good versus the graveyard decks, but in terms of a grindy kind of stopping your opponent's win conditions plan, what do you think about that? Is that actually a path towards victory, or do you think that going down a card from hand ultimately is going to end up being sufficient to win those later battles? Looks like we're in turns. I believe that's what that die is. So Murktide has shown up. Rob. Oh, and he drew a Pyroblast. What an absolute savage. Wow. Yeah, that game, Uro eventually was on his way. All of that to end in a very hard-fought draw.